It's 9 o'clock. Please invite the administration in.
我都係10分鐘啫。我大約係答，等佢講完晒啲嘢，我諗大約係9點9。
I'll let them finish first, and then let's have it at 9:45 for a 5-minute one.
我 make 我嘅唔係我嘅 register
to make my register.
嚇。各位同事，我哋而家
Members, before we formally begin, is there anything you need to declare? I already made a declaration just now at the House, at the internal meeting. I could be some sort of advisor or consultant to some NGOs. Yes, Mr. Peter Shill. Well, I need to declare as well because I am some advisors or consultants to some NGOs. Mr. Paul Chair, I don't need to declare in relation to any individual NGOs, but perhaps some NGOs. Mr. Ho, same as other members. And then I have a family member who works in the Social Welfare Department. We have a quorum now, so let's call this meeting to order. I'd like to welcome the Secretary for coming to our meeting today. I understand that you lost your voice yesterday, or perhaps Carol, the Director, could speak on your behalf. And we also have Katie here from the Administration Wing, and also Joseph, you are attending on behalf of the Secretary. Carol, you seldom are here on this side of the meeting room. I'm referring to Ms. Carol Yun. We have two Carols here. Ms. Carol Yun, Deputy Secretary for Financial Services and Treasury. You're here on this side. You are an advisor. And if there is anything about the FSTB's policy or related matters that I'd like you to speak on, please advise us. We used to have you over that side of the room, but I know that on this occasion you play a different role. We need to have an FSTB advisor here in case we touch on certain related matters. So let's begin. First of all, I'd like to invite the Director of Audit to brief us on the report number 69 of your report, Chapter 1. Please walk us through, and then I will invite the legal advisor to brief us on the funding agreement in relation to the Social Welfare Department and your responsibility before I invite the Secretary, or rather, Director, to speak. Following that, Mr. Lam Cheuk Ting, you are the lead member. So you're going to have 30 minutes to ask questions. You start first. So, Director of Audit. Chairman, members, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to brief members on Chapter 1 of Report number 69, Administration of Lump Sum Grants by the Social Welfare Department. There are 6 parts to this report. First, the report starts with introduction, which briefs readers on the background. The social welfare organizations are funded by the Social Welfare Department to provide about 140 welfare services, broadly categorized into 4 categories, namely elderly, family and children, rehabilitation, youth and correctional services. And lump sum grant system was introduced by the government in January 2001 as a major reform of the funding mechanism for organizations. The objective of the lump sum grant, or LSG system, is to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of organizations, to improve service quality and to encourage innovation. In 2016-17, the Social Welfare Department provided $12.5 billion of lump sum grants to 165 organizations under this system. And under the lump sum grant system, organizations can flexibly deploy the funds to provide support to staff in expenses and other operational costs. The Social Welfare Department and other ASUs agreed service units signed the FSA's funding and service agreements to stipulate the welfare services that each unit should provide. As of March 2017, the Social Welfare Department signed the FSAs with 2,700 ASUs of 165 organizations. Recently, in relation to the management of the lump sum grant system by the SWD, we conducted an audit on the financial monitoring and the assessment and monitoring of the service quality of organizations and the governance. Part 2 of the report reviews the financial monitoring of a lump sum grant system. We understand that the unspent funding of the organizations could be put into reserve for future uses. We understand that the reserve has grown. As of March 2016, altogether $4.7 billion of reserve have been made by these organizations. We also visited 6 organizations. We understand that some organizations did utilize the reserve, and in 2015-16, 31 organizations recorded a loss, and 14 of which have incurred losses for 3 consecutive years, and 8 of which already exhausted the reserve of the SWD funding. As of in July 2017, the administration wing informed the SWD to review and disclose the remuneration of the top 3-tier staff, and that is when calculating the relevant threshold for disclosure requirement. It is different from the intent expressed in the circular memorandum issued in March 2003 by the Director of Administration. Therefore, of the 165 organizations under the lump sum grant system in 2015-16, only 66 organizations were required to disclose the remuneration for the senior staff. In our audit, we found that apart from the FSAs, some organizations also provide or rather self-finance activities, but for funded and non-funded activities, the operational expenses are not properly apportioned. Rather, the expenses are made under the accounts of the ASU's funded activities, such that the government's funding might be used to subsidize non-funded activities. We recommend the SWD to devise appropriate measures to follow up on these matters. Third part of the report relates to the self-assessment of service quality by NGOs. According to the manual on lump sum grant drawn up by the SWD, if the funded organization's performance is not up to standard, clawback or termination of funding may occur. To make sure that their service standards are in line with the SWD's standard, the SWD has a self-assessment mechanism, and organizations are required to provide, report, and conduct self-assessment on a regular basis. In our audit, we found that there is a situation of overstatement or understatement of the service quality of organizations. We recommend that the SWD remind organizations the need to accurately report their service level and to make sure that during the self-assessment, the organizations and the ASUs must be prudent. Part 4 of the report relates to SWD's monitoring of the work of the organizations. On the one hand, the SWD reviews the service reports made regularly by funded organizations. On the other hand, the SWD also conducts visits and annual inspections to monitor the service quality of organizations. And from the service reports submitted by organizations to SWD, we reviewed 20 of them in the 5-year period between 2012-13 to 2016-17 in relation to units which for 3 consecutive years or above have not reached the relevant service quality or quantity. Although they have submitted action plans to improve services, they have been underperforming persistently, and yet all the service units receive full subsidy from the SWD. And among the 2,700 ASUs, only the funding of 8 units is pegged to the caseloads. As in terms of caseloads, these units meet the relevant requirements. They still receive full subsidy, and yet we have found that some of these units have not been performing well, and the users have not been receiving the required services. And some of these units have not made appropriate arrangements for the users to withdraw from the service, and therefore there was an overstatement of caseload. There are also users who at the same time received 2 services, and they should have only received one of the 2. And we also found that there are organizations allowing target users in some non-funded activities to take part in those activities. And also among the 2,700 units FSAs, 82% or 2,200 of them have not included the service quality standards, and also for 1,700 of or 63% of the FSAs, there is no need for full review because of lack of period for specified in the agreement. We recommend that the SWD followed up on these problems. Part 5 of the report relates to management and governance and management matters. The best practice manual encourages organizations to improve the financial arrangement, human resources management, corporate governance and accountability to improve governance. We found that some organizations have not followed and accurately make report in relation to the best practice manual, and the SWD have not included the 4 items related to human resources management in the BPM. We conducted visits of 6 organizations. We found that only 2 of them have reported attendance rates of the organizations or committee members. Also, between 2013-14 and 2015-16, for all the members absent from organization or committee meetings, the absence rate was as high as 21%. As for 4 other organizations, they have not made any form to require registration of interests of members. And for these 6 organizations between 2013-14 and 2015-16, the turnover rate was extremely high, ranging from 14 to 35%. We also noticed the relevant remuneration issues and its impact on stability of the organization and staff morale. We recommend the SWD to follow up on the above situation and to remind organizations and to provide support. Part 6 of the report relates to review of the lump sum grant system. It's been 8 years since the last review of the lump sum grant system, and time is ripe for a further review to improve the system. Our suggestions and recommendations have been accepted and agreed by the departments concerned, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank colleagues of the relevant departments for their full cooperation during the audit period, and also to provide active assistance and response. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director of Audit. I'd like to invite the legal advisor to walk us through certain matters, and that is in relation to the Social Welfare Department, the funding service agreements, and also other matters. Legal advisor. Thank you, Chairman. Now, when organizations receive funding, they would sign a funding and service agreement with the government, and that is FSA. In the agreement, the organization would undertake to observe all the clauses in the agreement in relation to all the clause and terms and conditions in the lump sum grant manual. So these organizations are deemed to have agreed to follow all the terms and conditions. And for the according to the PFO, the public officer is the social welfare, or the controlling officer is the social welfare department. So it defines the functions and role of the director of social welfare. Chapter 4 of the manual relates to accountability. It also defines the role of the director of welfare. For example, in paragraph 4.3, as the controlling officer, the director of welfare is required to properly implement the plan, the system effectively, and also in the process of reviewing the system, the director must consult the views of the organizations funded. And in paragraph 4.4, it defines the responsibilities and obligations and rights of the director of welfare. And the director of social welfare can exercise powers to do the following matters: to conduct an inspection, and according to the assessment of the service quality of organizations, to see if they're in line with the FSAs, and also to provide value for money audit or research in relation to the lump sum grant. The director also has the right to ask for records for the purpose of the value for money audit. And with the help of the ICAC, advice can be given on the anti-corruption measures. And also, there are also powers for the director to ask for statistics and reports. As an observer, the director can join the standing committee of the organizations. And also, paragraph G, if the organization prevents the director from exercising this power, the social welfare department can suspend the disbursement of funding and also withdraw or terminate the funding. The other paragraph is this: to exercise prudent financial management and also to enforce the relevant requirement. And in 4.12, if the social welfare department finds that the organization is not properly using public funding, the senior management of the person in charge of the organization may be invited to attend the PAC hearing. Thank you. I'll invite the secretary to speak, but
局長發言啊，局長因為把聲今日唔係好。
But the secretary is still recovering from the lost voice, so would you like to speak, Director? You have the speaking notes? Yes, the speaking notes have been tabled, but let me briefly walk it through for members. The government accepts the recommendations put forward by the Director of Audit in Chapter 1 of the report number 69. The SWD will actively follow up on the various recommendations with the sector, such that under the lump sum grant system, in terms of the financial monitoring of NGOs, the self-assessment of service quality by NGOs, monitoring of service quality by SWD, and corporate matters, they will be improved.
We will work together with the NGOs to on the review of the LSG subvention system, and in terms of implementation of the system, the SWD's follow-up work comprises of a few main areas. First of all, we will review the reserves of NGOs and the audited accounts in order to determine whether the NGOs achieve self-financing, and according to the circular issued by the Director of Administration, we will work with the sector on the practice of disclosing the remunerations of the NGO's top 3-tier staff. We will remind NGOs to establish internal control, including the apportioning of funds in FSAs and non-FSAs. They should also enhance transparency as well as communication with their staff. And fourthly, we will monitor consistently underperforming services, and we will also establish and review outcome standards with NGOs. We will establish best practice manual for the 4 sectors we mentioned. Since the implementation of the LSG subvention system in 2001, the government has maintained communication with the sectors as well as stakeholders. In 2008, the government appointed an independent review committee to assess the overall performance of the LSG subvention system and identify areas for improvement. According to the independent committee, they concluded that the principle of LSG subvention system is sound and that it should be retained. The committee offered 39 recommendations, which have all been adopted by the government. Since the implementation of the LSG subvention system, the government has provided more than 4 billion worth of extra one-off lump sum grants, as well as more than $800 million of recurrent funding for NGOs, and such funds would enhance the quality and research of services, as well as to provide enhanced central support to NGOs, and as well as employment support. Apart from allocation of resources, the government also commissioned universities, NGOs, and consultancies in organizing activities. And from September 2015 to February 2016, the SWD also launched a program on best practice manual on board and senior members of NGOs, and those included courses and training, and that helped enhance the transparency of governance as well as public accountability. That way, NGOs can be better equipped to face various challenges. Going forward, the government will continue to work with the sectors to facilitate the development of the LSG subvention system. In the Chief Executive's policy agenda, she made it clear that the government will work with the social welfare sector to optimize the LSG system. On this, the Secretary has requested the SWD to set up a dedicated task force on optimizing the LSG subvention system. So we will work with the trade to optimize the system. And this committee includes members from 10 sectors, including legislative councillors, HACSS, NGO management staff, NGO staff, service users, which are very important for the sectors, as well as 3 committees relating to the LSG subvention system, and we also have independent members, as well as members from the SWD and LWB. And we held our first meeting on 27th of November. As for the relevant agendas, minutes and documents, they would be available on the SWD website, and this is to enhance transparency. After establishing the scope of review, we expect it to be completed within 2 years. And based on the recommendations of this audit report, the review will take them on board as we go along. The first paper of the committee has included the relevant recommendations in our scope of review. Thank you very much. Before we enter questions and answers, I would like to invite the Deputy Secretary to brief us on these 5 letters. We received 5 submissions, and they are from the Christian Lutheran section, Hong Kong Family Welfare Council, Hong Kong Social Workers General Union, Hong Kong, and Hong Kong CSS. And these submissions have been shared with all attendees. Mr. Lam Shuk Ting, you will go first. You have 30 minutes. If you require more time, please feel free. We just received these letters and we don't have time to read them all yet, so we might follow up afterwards. First of all, good morning, fellow government officials. The audit report is about the administration of lump sum grants, and which is a matter of great public interest. There are 165 service units offering more than 100 types of services, including those for the disadvantaged groups. So we give much importance to this discussion. So today we might have to rely on the director to offer answers. In paragraph 2.13 of the report, as the Director of Audit has said, from 2015 to 16, of the 31 NGOs that incurred LSG deficits, 14 had incurred deficits for 3 consecutive years from 2013 to 14 to 2015 to 16. Of these 14 NGOs, 8 had depleted their reserves by the end of 2014 to 15. So tables 6 and 7 should be interpreted together, and table 7 shows that some NGOs have hefty reserves, the maximum being as much as $800 million. So what is the government's view on the consecutive years of deficit? Do you find the administration sound or otherwise, considering their reserves position? Director, you can defer to your team if you wish. Secretary, if you wish to speak, you may. Well, you can use sign language if you wish. Director, please. Director, please speak into the microphone. Chairman, thank you very much for the question. We also pay attention to the deficits of NGOs. The NGOs themselves have reserves, so if they suffer a year or years of deficits, we would look at their overall financial position. Some NGOs might suffer a deficit for a specific year because of over-provision of services or manpower. Have you been infected? I think I will get better by the afternoon. And the turnover rates of NGOs might be lower than expected, or there might be other unforeseen scenarios. But nonetheless, we would look at the overall financial positions of NGOs. As for paragraph 2.13, we can see that these NGOs still enjoy reserves, and we hope that NGOs can make good use of their own reserves. If they use their reserves, they might suffer an operating deficit. If they do not use their reserves, they might have an operating surplus. So it's important to look at the reserves of NGOs and their ongoing assessment. So when we determine whether an NGO is financially sound, we will look at both their reserves and financial projections, as well as their future service grants. So we would look at the overall situation. According to Table 6 and 7, even though some NGOs suffer deficits, they still hold positive reserves. So there are no issues financial-wise. Mr. Lam Shek Ting. Every year you would reserve financial statements from the NGOs on LSG. Did you identify any financially unsound NGOs? For NGOs with structural issues, we would discuss them with the relevant NGOs. We would encourage the NGOs to conduct actuarial service, and through actuarial service, we detected problems with their salary structure. For example, experienced staff might be overpaid. So we would assess their financial position with them. Chairman, some NGOs misestimated their financial positions, which led to mass layoffs, which was unfortunate. So for such cases, could the government detect the problems ahead of time so that they could issue advice or guidelines, or could these scenarios not be avoided? And I'm referring to scenarios which have been happening for some time. In our LSG manual, there are a few reminders to NGOs. If they engage in non-FSAs, they should inform the SWD. And in that case, the SWD would assess whether the services are related to the agreements and whether those services are sustainable, because we must look at the financial commitments. And thirdly, would the services be enhanced? And according to the LSG manual, if NGOs have financial difficulties, they should inform the SWD as soon as possible, so we can see what can be done in remedy. The NGOs engaged in non-FSA activities without notifying the SWD, and we did not have the chance to examine their financial commitments, and by the time they encountered financial difficulties, they might still enjoy positive reserves. And they did not notify us even when they foresee financial difficulties, and this has been mentioned in the audit report. We would communicate with the trades and remind NGOs that they must notify us as soon as possible. Secretary. At the end, the NGO mentioned by Mr. Lam did not lay off its staff. Mr. Lam, can I follow up on what the Secretary said? In paragraph 2.13, 31 NGOs incurred deficits in 2015 to 16, of which 14 had incurred deficits for 3 consecutive years. Why did you not follow up despite 3 years of deficits? Are these 14 NGOs still financially sound? This is what was said in paragraph 2.13. So, has there been any follow-up apart from addressing the financial positions? Have you looked at the quality standards or service quality standards? Did the service users enjoy the services? You have to protect the service users. So can you explain paragraph 2.13 in detail, please? Chairman, of the 14 NGOs, we would look at their annual financial reports as well as audited accounts. We have internal monitoring of these 14 NGOs, and we see that they still have positive reserves. In terms of service monitoring, that comes back to our FSAs. We would look at their reports, self-assessments, and we would also conduct spot checks on these NGOs. Under the FSAs, there are standards on service quality, and we found these 14 NGOs to be compliant in terms of service standards. Can you please tell us how you monitor the performance of these 14 NGOs in terms of provisional services, financial and governance situation, etc.? Mr. Lam Cheuk-Ting. Chairman, I'd like to follow up on another issue in 2.14.
Now they said here there were 2 NGOs suffering from serious deficits. Between 2014 to 16, the deficits were substantially increased. NGO 9, with regard to NGO 9, staff emolument accounted for 80% of total expenditure, and NGO K is 70 and 72%. I want to focus on NGO K, if you may refer to Table 9. Table 9. Staff with annual emolument over $500,000 to $1 million. In 2014, 76. In 2015, 133, an increase by the number of 57. And those who got more than 1 million per year, 15 in 2014-15 and 19 in 2015-16. I refer to the overall staff emolument 2014-15. The overall expenditure on staff emolument rose from $76.2 million to $111.4 million from 2014-15 to 2015-16. With regard to NGOK, with regard to the increase in salary of the top rank, while it was so high. With regard to NGOK, we cannot name NGOK. We did look into the financial situation of NGOK. With regard to the lump sum grant received by NGOK, it only spent the lump sum grant on 40% of its services. The remaining 60% were funds spent on non-FA activities, and they obtained the money from somewhere else. In 2015-16, they have more staff members being included in the range of 500,001 to 1 million. In that year, NGOK didn't increase the recruitment of senior staff or high-salaried staff, but by coincidence, they reached the top salary of SWA and ASWO. They adjusted the salaries of their staff members according to the government pay scale. Now, in that year, the staff members entered the range of that pay scale, and therefore, suddenly that number has increased. In that year, they didn't employ specifically high-pay staff. Did they give you any number on the number of staff members jumping whose salary points jump from less than $500,000 to more than $1 million? From $500,000 to more than $500,000. Mr. Kwok, I don't have the exact numbers in hand, but we can see that in the annual financial report by comparing the reports of 2 years. It will be hard for them to get information offhand, but if you can, please provide us with the follow-up information. If I may take the question. And ASWO, according to the government pay scale or midpoint pay scale, the salary is more than $500,000. And if he has passed the midpoint scale or just 1 point below the midpoint scale, he would have passed the $500,000 mark. You can provide more information in the report. I think the information should be available. The Director of Audit, concerning the matters mentioned by the Director. In the note, Mr. Chairman, note 2, K had 90 existing staff and 1 new recruit in the 2014-15 receiving an annual emolument between the range. The reasons are also given. Yes, thank you, Director. Chairman, I understand the explanation of the Director and the 2 directors, but public money is important. How many staff members had their salary points raised so that they were included in the range? The issue is whether somebody had a substantial increase in salary and whether that increase was reasonable. Let me now follow up on the disclosure of the top rank officers. Now, in 2003, the Director of Administration issued a circular. Unless the following conditions are fulfilled, paragraph 2.18, the subvented body receives government subvention of less than 10 million a year, or government subvention constitutes a proportion of 50% or less of the subvented body operating income. And C, to put it simply, the emolument of top 3-tier staff of the subvented body are funded entirely by income from sources other than the government. Now, this is connected by the conjunction or. So if you fulfill one of the conditions, you are allowed not to disclose the senior staff emoluments. Is my understanding correct? Director of Administration, your March 2003 circular. Yes, Mr. Lam, your understanding is correct. Chairman, if I may then quote 2.20 of the report. 2019 first. The effective date for the implementation of disclosure requirement was the 1st of April 2003. The memorandum said that Director of Bureaus with justification may approve implementation on a later date. That refers to the top 3 tiers of staff. And in 2.20, the SWD implemented the disclosure requirement with effect from a later date in 2009 and 10. In a paper submitted by in a meeting of the LSG Steering Committee, members' views were sought on implementation details. The lump sum grant has been implemented for a short period of time, and the LSG manual had to be revised to include the disclosure requirement. The SWD therefore only implemented the disclosure requirement in 2009-10. Now, I stop here first, Mr. Chairman. My question is, from 2003 onwards, 6 years were needed to implement this requirement. I really don't understand. Your explanation is rather difficult to understand. Chairman, now we've checked the documents then. In 2003, when the Director of Administration issued the memorandum, the lump sum grant system was only implemented for 1 year or so, and the sector had to adjust themselves to the new arrangements, and there were details to be ironed out. If the memorandum was implemented, then our manual would have to be amended comprehensively. Now, when the sector was implementing a completely new system, we prefer to let the system be consolidated before we implement the requirements of the memorandum. And in fact, we reported to the LSG Steering Committee, and in the Steering Committee there are members from the government bureaus. Ms. Lam, I find it difficult to understand. Now, you have the system there, and you require the disclosure of these emolument of top staff members. Why you didn't implement it? You are selective, or you were selective in implementing the requirement. Many frontline staff in the social welfare sector questioned whether the senior officers of the NGOs were having very fat salaries, while they didn't have to disclose that. Mr. Chairman, before we implement the arrangement of the memorandum or the requirement of the memorandum, the NGOs had to submit their annual financial report. They did submit the number of staff members and also the expenditure on the 6 levels of staff members with regard to the emolument, but that didn't meet the requirement of the memorandum. They did report to us staff emolument. When we checked the documents, at that time, it was decided that the implementation of lump sum grant was a new arrangement, and it was different from the reimbursement arrangement. The NGOs had to adjust to the system. In 2004, 2005, and subsequently, and in the subsequent years, with the implementation of efficiency enhancement arrangements, the NGOs had to adjust to many changes, and therefore it was decided that the NGOs should be allowed some time to consolidate the experience before implementing the scheme. I hope the Director of Administration will respond to the view of the Director of Social Welfare. The annual financial accounts did disclose the relevant staff emolument information. I want the Director of Administration to answer this. Was the disclosure as described by the Director of SW similar, or were there any difference with regard to the Director? With regard to our department, we didn't check the financial accounts of the NGOs receiving subvention from the SWD. I can only interpret the guideline for you. The objective was that the Secretary of the Bureau is the person who will decide how to supervise the subvented organizations. The subvented organizations are not our subordinates, and I did not see their papers. Just now, the legal advisor has explained that the arrangement under the FSA. They issued the guidelines in 2003, which would have to be implemented through the FSA. Maybe the DSW can answer my question. What are the differences between the two? The guideline 2003 and the FSA and K. Is it K? It's not K. It is on the overall relationship. It refers to para 2.20. If it is wrong, if you have been wrong, you can say so. We are going to find fact. If it is wrong, it is wrong, and there is no excuse. In 2003, that was the FSA. If you haven't done it, then you haven't done it. You don't need to find an excuse for that or the reasons for that. Chairman, the memorandum, which by the Director of Administration, which required the disclosure of the top 3-tier staff, we only implemented that in 2003. That was a delay. Between 2003 to 2009, you didn't do it. If you have done that, send us the paper to prove that. We didn't do that. In 2003, I explained that under the OSG system, the NGOs are required to provide the number of staff members who receive staff emolument, and also the range, say between 500,000 to 600,000, how many staff are receiving that amount of salary, but that is not the requirement of the memorandum. The memorandum requires the staff emolument information of the top 3 tier of staff members. Does it require the actual numbers? It is for the top 3 tiers. If there is only one on the top tier, then you just divide it by 12 and you know how much per month. If there are 3 in the second tier, then they provide the total. Is my understanding correct? According to the memorandum, the disclosure on the emolument of the top 3 tiers of staff members would be more specific. Yes. Well, you need. I give you some time to think about it. Yes, it will be more specific. Now you say that there are financial accounts, but that's only for reference. But the transparency is not as high as that is required by the memorandum. Now, yes, it is rather complicated. If we ask questions which are not in line with what you have explained, then please tell us. Yes, what is required by the memorandum is more specific. As I've explained, the financial accounts are to be submitted by each recipient NGO. As for the top 3 tiers, you can see that the memorandum by the Director of Administration is that if government subvention is less than 50% of the subvented body's operating income, then the NGO can be exempted. Chairman, in 2.20, there was no documentary evidence indicating that the LWB had, in accordance with the requirement of the memorandum, approved deferring the implementation of the disclosure requirement. Now, if the Secretary has justification, he can defer the implementation. The Director said that the steering committee had representatives from the Bureau. So was it an administrative oversight or what? Chairman, I referred to the old records. We checked the memorandum. And the memorandum required the approval of directors of bureaus, but it didn't require written permission. So you can make a call. We do have internal meetings with the director of bureau, and also the directors. I checked with the director of bureau, and there was no written record. But we do have day-to-day meetings with regard to the implementation of the memorandum. Is for certain that the director of the bureau and the director of the department knew that there would be a deferral in the implementation, but there was no written record. We think that is not desirable. A written permission is more appropriate.
And that is why we formally wrote to the Secretary, and the Secretary of the Bureau approved the approach. Was it Mr. Matthew Zhang who was the Secretary? Right. In 2009, Mr. Matthew Zhang, right? In 2003, Mr. Matthew Zhang was the Director. It was Mr. Matthew Zhang who was the Director in 2003. It was Dr. Yang who was the Secretary for Food and Health. So in relation to the guidelines, in 2003, it was Dr. Yang, and then in 2009, the Secretary was Matthew Zhang. Who was the Director in 2003? Director of Social Welfare, Mrs. Carrie Lam, as of the 1st of April. Thank you. So we're not picking on anyone, but we need to ask who the director was so that we could follow up on it.
計啦，當時應該口頭匯報過。
Because just now the answer was that she reckoned that oral approval was given. I found it absurd. Well, because the director isn't able to retrieve any document at the moment. I know, but it affects the welfare sector. As far as the administration and disclosure of information are concerned, if there is no information suggesting that approval was given, I find it really puzzling. It seems that we're not able to find out the truth. Well, the bureau doesn't have the information. You don't have the information, but you do accept that it is not desirable, right? Well, we need to be forward-looking, because without any paper trace, it's difficult for us to follow up on the matter anyway. Yes, Mr. Lam. Next, I'd like to ask about the threshold. Why is it that if the funding reaches a 50% threshold, the organization would need to disclose the emoluments of the top 3-tier staff? I asked about the circular memorandum. If the SWD used the consolidated operating income as the basis of determining the threshold, then there was a discrepancy in the understanding of the calculation method among the SWD and the NGOs. So what is meant by 50% income? I'm sorry, Kenneth, can you just stand in for me for a moment? I need to go down for 5 or 10 minutes for another meeting. I'm sorry, I need to go to another meeting. Briefly. Director, your response, please. As we mentioned just now, for the circular memorandum, in relation to the operating income, it is used as the basis for determining whether the NGO is receiving government subvention of over 50%. At that time, we inquired about the operating income information submitted by the NGO to the SWD. We were referring to the overall income, and because for welfare organizations, they might provide welfare services of different kinds on healthcare, education, and also community affairs. And the SWD has always asked the NGOs to provide information on the consolidated operating income. On the other hand, when we inquired with the administration wing, we asked the administration wing the following. That is, in relation to government subvention, should it just cover subvention on social welfare? Because we understand that the NGOs provide a variety of welfare services. So should we liaise with the Education Bureau and also the Home Affairs Bureau on their proportion of subvention to these organizations? And the reply we got was that there was communication between the NGOs and the government departments on how it was to be enforced. We found the discrepancy in our understanding, and we therefore clarified the matter with the administration wing. And we now understand that because the bureaus is only responsible for the relevant service or policy area, we should only focus on the subvention provided to the organizations on the relevant purview. That means the Social Welfare Department would not need to consider the education and home affairs subventions. As for the consolidated operating income, again, the operating income should only relate to the subvented services in the relevant area, that is social welfare. We do not have the breakdown, and we therefore need to discuss with the NGOs on recalculating the 50% threshold. how it should be calculated. And I'd like to supplement that we have actually begun our work and we are discussing with the organizations. As I said just now, in our task force, we have included this in our scope of work as well. Chairman, I try to understand what the criteria are in determining the 50% subvention threshold. Let's say the organization may provide two kinds of services, social welfare and education, and the subvention received from the government on social welfare may account for 80% of the total income, and also 70% on education, meaning that overall speaking, the government subvention received by the organization accounts for 50% or over 50% of the operating income. According to the department's or the Bureau's understanding, even if the proportion is really high, because of the fragmented approach of government departments, say for subvention on social welfare services is below 50%, so no disclosure. Whereas for education, likewise, the education subvention doesn't exceed 50%. And assuming that the Education Bureau also adopts the same approach, then there won't be any disclosure at all. Is it really logical? Director. Chairman, we exactly focus on social welfare subventions. If the government subvention on social welfare exceeds 50%, we require disclosure. And that's your understanding now, isn't it? Perhaps the administration wing can supplement in a moment, or perhaps Secretary. Let me try to respond to Mr. Lam's point of view. Well, if we refer to Note 22, we may have a better idea. A is the SWD's existing calculation, meaning the calculation adopted by SWD after 2009, and B is the calculation according to the intents of the memorandum. Either way of calculation will not result in what Mr. Lam suggests. If we use method B, there is one point to note. For example, the NGO's operating income from the SWD divided by the operating income of the NGO under the purview of the Secretary for Labour and Welfare or the Director of Social Welfare. To my understanding, for social welfare organizations, as long as they receive subvention from the SWD, all the operating income deriving from the same unit will not exceed that percentage, meaning that all NGOs receiving subvention from the SWD under calculation method B will be subject to disclosure, except, for example, the other criterion on the ceiling of subvention. Let's say if the organization provides healthcare, education, and also welfare, community affairs, and even CMAB services, the NGOs might be subject to the disclosure requirement imposed by different bureaus and departments, because those bureaus and departments at the same time are only focusing on the relevant purviews. It might not be a desirable practice because the administration wing at the moment is collecting information in this regard, and as the Secretary for Labour and Welfare, on implementation of the calculation method in the memorandum, I have the responsibility of discussing with the bureaus and departments on the appropriate application of the memorandum. Therefore, I feel responsible that we must discuss with the NGOs in coming up with a better way of dealing with this. I have a follow-up question. In the audit report, I understand that one of the problems is this, in relation to the allocation of operating income. The question is for Note 22B, even if you have a new calculation method, will we be able to accurately attribute NGO's operating income to SWD? Or would they rather just arbitrarily allocate the operating income? I want to know whether you're facing any difficulty. Is the income from SWD or not? Or is it somewhat in between? Because the NGOs could take this opportunity to engage in arbitrage or things like that. I want to know whether the Director of Audit could provide any assistance. Thank you, Chairman. Over the years, the method of calculation hasn't been clear. It has to do with the nominator and the denominator. If we take a look at Note 22, A and B, the denominator is the NGO's operating income from the SWD. However, for some NGOs, they receive not only lump sum grant from the SWD as their income, they also receive income through other means. Let's make a hypothesis. Let's say if they have an income of $1 million, $500,000 may come from SWD subvention. And the practice is that if it did not exceed 50% of the operating income from the SWD, no disclosure is required. So the NGO might also receive income from other departments, and that's their way of calculating the threshold. But our understanding is that the denominator should be smaller, as $500,000 instead of $1 million should be used as the denominator, and that's the issue. Well, just now I asked about the denominator. As for the denominator, numerator, but I would like to ask about the other point. Well, let me give you an example. For the Integrated Youth Services Center, the resources might come from Social Welfare Department, the Education Bureau, or other policy bureaus or departments. However, when we check the accounts of these organizations, as far as the activities are concerned, it is very difficult to apportion each and every activity to the financial resources. Even if we're checking these organizations' accounts, it is impossible to have a breakdown of the books of every activity. So there is practical difficulty in implementing Formula B. Sorry, Mr. Lam, I've taken up your time. I'd like to ask a final question, 2.23, paragraph 2.23. In June 2013, the SWD contacted the FSTB, in July 2013. And then the FSTB advised it would need more time to consider the matter. The SWD could not find any records on the FSTB's response. And then the FSTB informed Audit that there was no written correspondence between the SWD and the FSTB. So what is going on? Was there or was there not any communication between the two bureaus? Who would take the question? Director. In June 2013, the SWD wrote to the administration wing requesting an explanation. And then the administration asked the SWD to seek advice from the FSTB, and it was in writing. I found that there was an email in our internal system. A colleague was to ring the FSTB colleague to relay the message from the administration wing. It was an internal record of the colleague saying that the FSTB advised that it would need more time to consider the matter. Indeed, there was no written correspondence. We also agreed that it was undesirable. In the beginning of this year, as we also discussed the matter with the Legislative Council back and forth on requesting the organizations to disclose the emoluments for the top 3T staff of organizations, we found some ambiguities. So in the beginning of this year, in January, we wrote to the administration wing again. Apart from written correspondence, we even had face-to-face meetings. I'm not asking about what happened subsequently. I asked why there hadn't been any written correspondence before. I'd like to ask the FSTB. Please address the question to me, Mr. Lam. Chairman, I have this question. Can the FSTB confirm that the SWD colleague did ring a colleague of yours and that you advised you needed more time to consider the matter? Mr. Chan? Thank you, Mr. Lam, for your question. Like the Director of Social Welfare said just now, back then, we can confirm that back then there was no written correspondence between the SWD and the FSTB. So nothing in writing. We also checked the records. There was no record of such a telephone conversation. Mr. Lam. I think that this is dereliction of duty on the part of the Social Welfare Department because it's such a serious and technical question. How could you just ask a colleague to ring them and then just put away the matter? And then the Bureau's reply now is that they have never received such an inquiry. This is not how the government works, as I understand. Very often we make inquiries in black and white. Why is it that for such a technical question you could just ring them and then the other side would say that they had no record? They never received the phone call. If this is how the SWD goes about its business, how can you be accountable to our council and to the public? You don't even have any record. Do you agree that this is dereliction of duty? Director, can you explain to us the practice of keeping phone records? Chairman, I think I need to go back and check. In June 2013, we sent a memo to the administration wing. I'd like to know whether we've carbon copied that to the FSTB. I think that even if it was CC'd, it was undesirable. There should be proper written record. Yes, Director, you could go back and check all these records. It might not be just a single piece of memorandum. It might be certain copies. Please try to give us copies because it will be put on record. Otherwise, there is no official record.
You cannot just issue a letter and forget about it. You must follow up on that. This is only common sense. So it's regretful that you could not even do that. I want to ask about paragraph 2.38. The need to apportion head office overheads. According to the Audit Commission, some NGOs are subsidizing the expenses of the NGO's head office using the subvention. And the salaries are attributed to the FSAs? And is this already a breach of the agreement requirements? Director? We require NGOs to discriminate between FSAs and non-FSAs, and they need to apportion the accounts accordingly. Our finance branch will examine their apportionments. In other words, if there's no apportionment, it would be a breach of the relevant FSAs. Chairman, we need to look at the situation case by case. For head office overheads, we would assess whether the funds could be apportioned, so it would depend on the actual case. For example, for lighting or electricity bills, it's hard to differentiate between FSAs and non-FSA items. Some NGOs say despite the subvention received, they must do more, or they would do more to serve different people. And this is related to the services within the scope of LSG. They would not ask for extra money, but they would simply make use of the existing LSG sums to provide extra services. So they think that they should not be asked to exclude those expenses. So what is the government's take on this? A lot of NGOs engage in related services. So if the services provided are related, they could be covered in our subvention. So it would depend case by case. Mr. Lam, any follow-up? One final question. I want to ask about paragraph 2.39 as well. In paragraph B, the head office overheads amounted to some $10.5 million for NGO I, some $16 million for NGO J, and some $22.2 million for NGO K. And it says these large amounts of overheads, however, had not been properly accounted for. So for the Director of Audit and Director of Social Welfare, what does it mean that they have not been properly accounted for? There was no apportionment of the overall or such overheads. Director of Social Welfare, do you agree that this is an issue which should be explained? We saw that there was no apportionment. For details, I would defer to Mr. Kwok. Thank you. According to the LSG manual, expenses incurred by non-FSAs by NGOs, if there is no apportionment, it is a breach of our agreements. But we would find out more about such expenses from the NGO, so we would follow up. We would determine the specific apportionments. That would be part of our follow-up work. Mr. Lam, for case 1, it says FSA users, non-FSA users amounted to 54% and FSA users 46%. So without apportionment or sufficient apportionment, do you find such practice acceptable? So before you conduct an investigation, can you answer this question? Chairman, we found out about this case, and the NGO has adopted the same apportionment formula for a long time. The number of service users have changed. They now have more users, and the NGO admitted that they must make corrections. And apportionments should be made for the LSG funds. I have no further questions for Chapter 2. I will allow Mr. Stephen Ho to ask his question first. We will have a 10-minute break by 11 a.m. Mr. Ho, I would like to follow up on 2 questions. I want to follow up on with what Mr. Lam said on paragraph 2.39. The government seemed to have dodged their responsibility. In case 2 and paragraph 2.39, 3 NGOs, I, J, and K, were named. Their head office overheads had been allocated entirely to FSA activities. So for how many years have this situation persisted? Mr. Kwok? We have no information on hand on the number of years. The audit report pointed out such a big problem, and today at this public hearing the government says they do not know about it. If you tell us you have too much information on hand and you don't have time to read it all, that would be more acceptable. But have you actually read the information at all? Chairman, we touched base with the NGOs, and they have different views on the apportionment arrangements. So this is the current situation. We will need to follow up with these NGOs on how they carried out the apportionment in the past. Chairman, the director is still dodging the question. I'm not asking about the apportionment arrangement. The expenses were entirely paid by the government. For how long has this situation persisted? Is the government aware of that? Mr. Kwok, if you have no such information, please provide the information afterwards. So if you give us an answer, what you say will go on record, and this might not be fair to you. So please go back and come back with a response. Chairman, sorry about my voice. Perhaps you can speak into the microphone. Apportionment is needed for services outside of the scope of agreement. For example, for private donation activities, NGOs do not need to report them to the SWD. So when our finance branch staff carry out the examination, we might not have such information, but that said, we will share what we have. I want to ask about case 2 as well. For the third point, furthermore, audit noted that the emolument of the NGO's chief executive officer, 1.57 million for 15-16, based on the latest available AFR, had been solely charged to FSA activities. So the NGO pays for the staff's emolument with public money. I don't quite understand the logic. Director. Our subvention to the NGOs include their staff and management staff. If an NGO wishes to pay for the emolument of the CEO, they would have to pay it out of the subvention. Some might be under SFA, some not. But the beneficiaries are members of the public, so apparently you did not draw a very clear line. So there would be a reason, right? The NGOs offer various services which would benefit the public. But as for the allocation of services without subvention, we must be financially prudent. So that's why we have such apportionment arrangement. For an elderly center or neighborhood center, we must make sure that the subventions are used in specific services, but nonetheless, there is flexibility. For agreement-related services, for example, those targeting the same users, including the elderly, etc., these would be deemed relevant to the agreement, and we would include these in our subventions. But for specific services in the agreements or non-FSAs, the NGOs should notify us. We are not saying that we do not allow it, but hopefully you can explain the situation. There are FSA specified services and SFA and FSA related services and also non-related services. So there are three types. Years ago, most NGOs engage in subvented services, but in the past 20 years, the ecology has slowly changed. NGOs are increasingly securing outside services or related services. So that might not be an issue 20 years ago. And not many NGOs engage in non-FSA activities, so the difference was not material. So 20 years ago, overhead expenses or CEO emolument would not be apportioned, but with a change of scenes, we need to pay more attention to this issue. So I think the audit report would be inspiring to our work going forward. He didn't answer my question. If NGOs meet the 50% threshold, they have to disclose the emoluments of its management staff. So did this NGO ever cross the 50% threshold? So my point is, if they did not cross the threshold, they did not need to disclose the emolument. They did crossed the threshold and they did make a disclosure. So what was the percentage? If the percentage is 80 to 90%, it might be relatively reasonable. They might secure other sources of subvention. If they are a borderline case, I think the $1.57 million should not be solely charged to FSA activities. Now back to paragraph 2.13. Some NGOs face 3 years of deficit, and the figures are listed in table 6 and 7. So the figures for 2016 to 17 are not yet available. Is that correct? For para, you answered the point on 2.13. Now he's asking about 2016 to 17. Do we have the figures yet? They were submitted in October, so we are still gathering the data. The government said you would initiate measures in order to improve their performances, but if these doesn't also NGOs continue to incur deficits, what would you do in 2016 to 17? It might be difficult for you to explain figures for 2016 to 17 when they are not available. So can you offer us a paper later on 2016 to 17? We have no data yet for 2016 to 17. I think we should look at the actual facts. So, Vice Chairman, on to you. We would not discuss policy, but we would ask questions based on a value for money perspective. For not-for-profit activities, we certainly do not want to stand in the way. But according to report number 69, we do have to ask questions that might relate to policy. So please answer our questions based on what is in the report or documents. Thank you very much. Kent Leung. My coming questions are about the about the reserves. Let's look at table 4. There are 3 reserves for each NGO. One is called LSG reserves, which is the balance of the lump sum grant deducted by the amount clawed back to government. And we also have a holding account, which is part of the historical context. And we also have the Provident Fund account, for Provident Funds Reserve. By the end of 2016, by the end of March, the total reserves was $4.7 billion. So that was something from table 4.
Now then, let's turn over the page to table 5. This table provides the details of the reserves. It's rare that a NGO doesn't have any reserve. Either you have LSG reserve or you have holding account reserve. I want to ask a basic question. With regard to these reserves, They are numbers on the asset on the balance sheet. Now, apart from cash, do the NGOs have fixed assets or other assets? Whether it's the director or director of audit or director of social welfare, can you explain to us the amount of reserves? On the other side of the balance sheet, now the reserves is a forward accounting number. Will there be an equal number of cash? That's the first question. Director of Audit. It's hard to answer in a general way. The reserves is a credit. On the other side, whether it is investment, fixed asset, or cash, that varies from NGO to NGO. Thank you. And that's very basic. I want to clarify this. The public also wants to know. Chairman, if I may provide some information to help members understand the table. In the lump sum grant manual, the NGOs are required to invest the reserves under certain principles. Although you cannot match one number with another number, generally, they are liquid assets. Some cash, some fixed deposits. If my understanding is correct, they may also invest in bonds. There are restrictions. It must be liquid assets. Can you show us, can you produce the document for us? Chairman, I just want to know what class of liquid assets can they put the reserves. The Director. In our manual, 2.32, paragraph 2.32. Please speak closer to the microphone. If I can't hear you, this is the only microphone I have. Yes, 2.32, paragraph 2.32. An equal amount of reserves must be put in a separate interest-bearing account in a licensed bank in Hong Kong. So you can only put it in the bank. Is my understanding correct? And you have reserves of 3 different kinds of function. Do you need 3 accounts? Maybe I can read out 3.324.
G must be kept in a reserve fund and reported to SWD as part of the LSG AFR. An amount of cash equivalent to the accumulated reserve must be kept in a separate interest-bearing account with a bank licensed in Hong Kong.
Okay.
So is your question answered? Yes, part of. The accumulated reserve refers to the LSG reserve, doesn't it? Or there should be a cash account for each kind of reserve. I'm not quite clear about it. It is rather complicated, so we need to clarify this. Director, maybe Mr. Kwok can supplement. According to Manual Para 2.33, it says that money can be put in deposits, Hong Kong dollar deposits, CDs, and bonds. Okay, I understand the situation. Now, Table 4, $4.7 billion in 2016. I want to refer to LSG reserve, which are a common concern. Now, according to your requirement, if the surplus of an NGO, if there is a surplus exceeding 25% of the total revenue, then those about the amount above will have to be paid, clawed back to the government. So in the LSG reserves, they can at most keep 25% of the expenditure under the agreement, the director. According to 2.32, the reserves refer to accumulated reserves, and the cap is 25% of the operating expenditure of the NGO. The 25% refers to accumulated surplus reserves. Accumulated reserves over the operating expenditure of the year, not excluding MPF. LSG reserves do not include PF reserve. Now, the financial year is different. When will you consider there is an excessive surplus, and whether there is any clawback? Do you do that actually? Every year, a NGO will have to provide the accounts in October. Say in October 2017, they will have to provide the financial accounts and annual reports in October for 2016 and 17. Now you receive the report in October, say 2017. A few months ago, you received the reports. If there is an excessive reserve, how soon will you claw back the money if there is excess reserve? Can you give us a rough idea? Now, Kenneth asked you about the accumulated reserve. Do you have the power to take back the money that has been approved or that was approved in the past? It is 25% over so many years, and each year is different. Every year when we look at the accumulated reserve, and if it exceeds 25% of the operating expenditure, then we will claw back the money. They will have to return the money to the government. As to when the NGO has to pay back, we have to wait for the annual report and annual accounts. And we have to consider the time as well. Now we have discovered that if there is excess reserve, then we talk to the NGO and then ask for the return of the excess reserve. So you will claw back instead of deducting the money from the subvention. I confirm that we take back. Kenneth, I just want to clarify this. In your 2.32 of your manual and also 2.33, you don't just look at 1 year, you also look at previous year's reserve. Reserve is rollover. You cannot claw back the rollover. We look at the accumulated reserve. 2.32 and 2.33 deal with the accumulated reserve. And your power is that when the reserve exceeds 25%, you will have to claw back. I want to clarify this because we are no experts. Non-experts asking expert questions, so you have to explain that to us.
32.33嗰度咧，你有個 cumulative.
In 2.33, you have the term cumulative surplus. Is about putting money with the bank, fixed in terms of fixed deposit. But concerning clawback, and you can only have clawback if it exceeds 25%. Kenneth, Now, when they drop a budget and ask for subvention, well, I just guess, will they inflate the number? Have you noticed such a practice? If you may refer to Table 4 and also Chart 1 of Part 1, I have seen, or Figure 1, I have seen a sort of correlation. LSG subventions are in a rising trend, and LSG reserves are also on a rising trend. So have they taken that into account? There is a 25% buffer. They increase their amount asked for so as to increase the buffer. Is there such a correlation? The Secretary, in the funding process, we do not look at the budget. The budget is based on Head 170 approved by the FC. And the calculation is based on the principle under the lump sum grant system. When each NGO asks for an amount for the year, do they give you any budget? No need. Now, your funding for each NGO is different. The formula is the same. The formula is static. Now, the formula is based on midpoint salary scale times the number of staff. And there are other costs. Apart from staff costs, there is provident fund, and there are other costs. They have to give you a budget. You must have a benchmark apart from headcount. Does the NGO, or do the NGOs give you a budget, or do you just calculate according to your formula? Now, in 1.12 and 1.19, 1.19 and 1.12, maybe you can refer to this in order to explain to the Vice Chairman. You understand my point? Chairman, if I may explain the principle, and then the Deputy Director will speak on the detailed operation. The member is very concerned why there is the issue of reserve and surplus. We calculate the manpower structure to provide a certain service, say how many social workers, how many PTOTs, and what other costs are required. We do the sums, and then we come up with the lump sum. And the lump sum will be given to the NGO. If it's a new service, or if they have new recruits to provide the service, unavoidably they will have to keep some reserve. Say, in the provision of a social worker, in doing the calculation, we work on the midpoint salary scale. Say, a new social worker, 0.16, but we provide the funding with the midpoint. And that's how the NGOs try to juggle the sums. When they employ a new recruit, then the salary is smaller than the amount we allocate to the NGO. But when experience is gained and where there is increase in salaries, then the amount may be higher than the midpoint. It is 1.9 and 1.12, not 1.19, just for correction. Now, the lump sum grant is like a standard cost in concept. There are two elements, PE and other charges, including overheads, power, utilities, so on and so forth. Some are related to history. From 1999 to 2003, 2004, there was EPP. So you can, and that is an impact. You can see that there are differences between one unit and another. But the difference is the result of history. If there is no such an impact, then everyone should comply with the standard cost, and they should be roughly the same. I hope that helps. Apart from the headcount on the social workers, what is the basis for calculating other expenses? I have not seen any formula for calculating utilities and equipment. There are three parts: staff salary, provident fund, and other costs. And he asks about other costs. And then you take away the revenue, and that is the lump sum grant. Yes, I try to attempt to answer the question. And then it will be supplemented by the Deputy Director. In implementing lump sum grant, there was OC. Everything other than P, other charges. At that time, an average number was used to calculate the OC. That was historical. Later, the adjustment was based on an inflation number provided by the government. The OC was then adjusted accordingly. So the number was historical. Now, there are changes in services, and then there are adjustments, or there were adjustments over the years. Yes, every year when we allocate funds to our service units, we consider what service items are provided by the NGOs, and then we have a reference staff structure or staff establishment. Say how many staff members of what grades. And then we calculate the PE, personal emolument. And that's for the lump sum grant in respect of personal emolument. Other charges include utilities. Some may want a lift, and the operating costs of the lift will also be included. And when we consider the amount to be given, we refer to the composite price index, to adjust other charges. They do have charges. They do impose charges on the users. Now we have a PE plus other charges minus revenue, and that equals the allocation. My question is, in allocating the funds, in what stage will the NGO participate? It's not drawing up the budget. You comply with some formula. Say if the NGO requires a lift, does it formally tell you, or does it write a memo to you? He doesn't want a lift. They don't want a lift. They want special medical equipment,
which may cost several $million. I'm just making up an example. Let's say if they need this facility for this service item, would there be any discussion, or would you initiate the would you ask them about that on your own initiative? If the lift relates to the other expenses relevant to the premises, then when we hand over the premises for the organization to provide this service, we would know, and this would be included in the calculation of expenses and charges. Well, the honourable member just now mentioned a facility that might be more costly, and they could apply with the lottery fund for the procurement of this facility. So it's not part of the lump sum grant. Kenneth, can you follow up on this? Because for the funding provided by the the lottery fund, it is on a reimbursement basis. Well, just now for the OC, Secretary explained the historical method of calculation. But as prices go up, the OC would be inflated. So you can see that in 2016-17, $12.7 billion were spent on OC. You asked a number of questions. Setting aside staff emoluments or provident fund, even for charges, it could be easily overlooked because you need to deduct that from the income. And there could be a surplus. And that's the crux of the discrepancy. Accounting for the surplus. Just let them explain how they control the charges. I just want to bring out this question. 1.19 or 1.20, I'd like them to explain this.
我哋咧其實喺即係圖一嗰度咧，我哋知道譬如話2016
In 2016-17, Chairman, altogether there was a lump sum grant of $12.5 billion that covered staff emoluments, other charges, and charges imposed by the organizations in the Provident Fund. Yes, you have taken those out already, but for other charges, you have not taken that out. As mentioned just now, every year, we made adjustments according to the changes in the composite price index. Kenneth, I understand that the lump sum grant is an alternative budgeting process. The government allows the other party to prepare the accounts. But we understand that for some companies or departments, we take the zero budgeting approach. It's a bottom-up approach, and what you mentioned just now is a top-down approach. I understand these two concepts, and there are divergent views on the pros and cons of these two approaches. But let me ask about the PF reserve first. The reserve is to be spent on retirement protection for staff, right? In year 2000, when lump sum grant was introduced, you needed to take a snapshot on the basis of the actual amount, and after April 2000, you adopted a percentage of 6.8% of the master pay scale, and that is 6.8% times the number, and that is the amount of the Provident Fund. And there are two parts to this approach, and I find this estimate quite strange, because the majority of employers have taken out MPF for its members. It's kept at $1,500 or 5%. But is it the case that you're ignoring this and rather adopting this percentage as a reserve? Because for the mandatory provident fund, it was introduced in December 2000, and if this scheme is applicable to all organizations, and if the organization isn't particularly generous, then the basic legal obligation of the organization is to provide a contribution of $1,500 or 5%. So you can more or less come up with a figure for the reserve for provident fund or MPF, however you call it. But of course, I understand that some organizations might not opt for MPF. They might have the ORSO scheme instead. I don't know why. After year 2000, you didn't use the MPF contribution percentage as the basis of your calculation, but allowed the figure to continue to increase. But before you answer, Director, the The question actually relates to 1.12b. It's actually 2.3b on Provident Fund. Secretary. Well, Chairman, Dr. Leung asked about the 6.8%. In year 2000, when we designed the LSG system, we took into account the welfare organizations in the welfare sector and the subvented organizations, the basis of calculating the entitlement for provident funds. We took a snapshot exercise on organizations adopting an employer's contributions of 5, 10, or 15%. And then according to the midpoint salaries of these organizations, we came up with a figure of 6.8%. That is to say, for the Provident Funds provisions for these subvented organizations, is 6.8% of the midpoint salaries of these notion organizations. That is to say, when the LSG system was introduced, if the organization structure remained the same, the organizations could continue to provide the provident funds on the basis of 5, 10, or 15% of the employees' contributions. Back then, there was the MPF system, which was endorsed by the Council but not yet implemented, was not taken into account. Understood. For the provision of provident funds, apart for provident fund benefits, and I'm referring to paragraph 2.3b, it could also be used for special contributions to award so and so. So we have a reserve here. Does it mean that the reserve could be used for bonus payments to the staff of these organizations? That is, on top of their salary entitlements, could they also receive end-of-year bonus from the reserve? No. The PF reserve could only be used for the provision of provident funds. Some organizations actually are still using 5, 10, or 15% contribution in exceedance of the employer's contribution under the MPF system. Well, let's say if I contribute 30% to your account instead of 5, 10, 15%, then I can use the PF reserve in this way. Right, theoretically, yes, for the purpose of the Provident Fund. So it's a kind of deferred bonus. Is that right? Because it comes in the form of employees' contribution. That's exactly 2.3b. Yes, let's refer to 2.3b. What I'm saying is this. If you want to give out year-end bonus and then end-of-year bonus, and then you can make a deferral, and then you can claim that because of the competence of this staff member, I decide to give 50% contribution this year. So this is a loophole. Perhaps let them explain. The Secretary just now confirmed that it is possible. That is possible, but no organization has ever done that because the organizations uphold the equity principle. It's an accumulative reserve. When the organizations consider how the reserve is to be used, they need to consider the principle of equity. Another question. Some organizations might adopt a provident fund and make 5, 10, or 15% contributions. Did any organization switch to MPF so as to save up? And yet, for these organizations, you've continued to adopt the same calculation method for the PF reserve. Among the 100-odd organizations, did any such organization adopt this method? Director, do you have this information? I don't have information at hand, but I'd like to explain that they do not have this incentive because the PF reserve can only be used for the provision of provident funds. It cannot be used for staff emoluments or the provision of services. That is to say, the PF reserve is solely for the purpose of provident funds. Right, but exactly, I was giving you a tip on how it could be used. You can increase the percentage of voluntary contribution, and then somebody might pocket the contribution this way. I'm giving you new thinking. It's a loophole, and I think somebody might exploit this loophole. And I think it's a timely review of the PF reserve is needed. We'll take a 10-minute break, Chairman, before we resume. But I hope that after the 10-minute break, we will have a quorum. Can I supplement, Chairman, on Dr. Leung's question? You mentioned top-down. You have an honor system. I need to supplement because it's a matter of principle. Dr. Leung mentioned top-down approach and that he finds it problematic. I need to go back on the point of other charges. Whenever we roll out the new service item, we discuss with the sector and see if they encounter problems on staffing arrangements and expenses. And for other charges, as explained just now, adjustments are made in accordance with the composite price index changes. In 2014, we gave up a one-off grant of $1.47 billion because according to the sector, changes in prices could not reflect certain expenditure. For example, insurance premiums or food prices, these are not reflected in the CPIs. And this is recurrent subvention, and we've covered the increase in other charges. So to supplement, we all along have been discussing and reviewing the arrangement with the sector. Well, just, Chairman, perhaps please allow Mr. Stephen Ho to ask his question as well. If you want me to be here, I will be here. Well, let's resume after 11:30. Thank you.